All right, everyone, welcome back. So, this is where we're going to pick off here in our tour of the domains of life. Okay, so now we are in domain eukarya. We're talking exclusively about things that have nuclei, that have different organelles, that have multicellular representation. Okay, not all of the life we're going to talk about will be multicellular. In fact, a lot of it will not be. But we're going to start here with these three kingdoms within eukarya. Okay, kingdom Plantae, kingdom Protozoa, kingdom Chromista. So the first thing we have to do is talk about this thing that we call algae, because this is a major non-taxonomic classification that we talk about a lot. It's not exclusive to one of those kingdoms. Aquatic habitats are rife with microorganisms. They have a lot of them, and many of them are photosynthetic, as in they do photosynthesis. They take carbon dioxide and water and react them using the power of sunlight to create sugar and oxygen. Okay, and oxygen is mainly a byproduct that it's created and then released. These photosynthetic microbes, they can range in size, they can range in complexity. These things are what we tend to call algae. Okay, and again, this stuff that we call algae, it's not one distinct taxonomic group. It's actually a bunch of different things. It's very diverse. And we have representatives of algae in plants, in protozoans, in chromists. We're going to talk about all of those here. And we mainly find them in like marine and freshwater environments, but we can also find algae on land as well in certain habitats. So, let's talk about some of these algae. Starting with plants. Green algae, we're going to talk about. Again, even within plants, it's not even a true taxonomic group. There's a few different things that make this up, but they have some important characteristics. These green algae are mostly microbial, meaning that they're too small for us to see with the naked eye. And they're also among the most ancestral of plants. So these green algae are maybe closer to what plants used to look like when they first emerged. Single-celled, simple, photosynthetic life forms. And they also occur pretty widely in some very diverse habitats. Freshwater and marine environments, but also in soils and on damp surfaces, like surfaces that are dampened often, like, for example, a slick side of a rock. Most of these algae are actually motile, which means they're capable of movement. They get around with these little whip-like structures that they have on their bodies called flagella, although a lot of them also lack flagella, meaning that they just go where the water takes them. And these are mainly unicellular. These are mostly unicellular, but there are some groups, particularly, there are a few that are kind of riding the line that are not quite fully unicellular. They're starting to become multicellular, which is very interesting. Now, I just wanted to kind of showcase a couple really cool ones that are really interesting. These are some of my favorites that I see periodically. I do a little bit of microscopy every now and again for some local waterways, stuff like that. It's really fun to kind of see what's growing out there. And these are different groups that we see routinely kind of everywhere. These belong to an order called Desmodales, and there's around 6,000 known species. They don't have flagella, so they can't move, but they do exhibit some really cool symmetry. I like this Closterium species that's very banana-like, personally. I think these are super neat. And there's a lot of weird, a lot of stuff that we don't fully understand about them as well. And so it's pretty cool. So then we have diatoms, okay? Diatoms belong to that lesser known kingdom called Chromista. They have their own class. It's called class Bacillariophyceae. They're really diverse. There's between 12 and 30,000 species. There's a lot that we have not described. This is just what we have actually described. And they're all photosynthetic. Okay? They're all capable of photosynthesis. There are freshwater and marine varieties of these groups. And they're really interesting because of these really pretty geometric shapes that they tend to take. Okay? Their shells are all made of like silica. They're made of like glass, basically, that they secrete and form, and they a lot of them can move in ways that we don't fully understand how at this point. They're just really cool, really interesting, and actually historically, it was a hobby that like some people like these like in like Victorian times. It was a hobby for people to create tiny, microscopic diatom art by just simply using a human hair on a slide to push these little cells into place to create some really beautiful designs. So these are some examples of some more modern stuff that people have made. It's really interesting. Then we have dinoflagellates. Okay, dinoflagellates belong to their own superclass, Dinoflagellata, in Chromista again. Okay, and there are fewer species of this group, mostly marine. They're all photosynthetic, all planktonic, which means that they kind of go where the water takes them. Dinoflagellates are really weird because they don't typically have symmetry. They're like lacking in that symmetry. Their shell exhibits a lot of different shapes. They're made of very different things than a diatom shell. A diatom shell, again, is made of silica like glass, but a dinoflagellate makes its shell out of calcium carbonate, very similar to how clams and snails make their shells. And they navigate through their environment. They're very motile. They navigate using multiple flagella that are arranged in weird ways. Essentially, they have like several axes of flagella that move and push them around in multiple directions. Now, we are more familiar with dinoflagellates as the cause of red tides. Not so much an issue where we live, but in some parts of the country, particularly along the coastline, dinoflagellates can be a danger or a nuisance to people and to just like populations of wildlife under the right conditions. So when conditions are right, if they get like the right access to the right nutrients, some dinoflagellates can experience a rapid population boom where they just rapidly start to reproduce, and they make more and more and more and more of themselves until they literally start to change the color of the ocean. A lot of these microbes are red in color, usually too small to have any real impact on the color of these environments. But under these conditions, they can turn the whole, like the ocean in these parts red. And so this can be a problem mainly because some of these species, not all of them, produce these toxins that are usually made in low quantity, essentially to deter predators from eating them. But now there's a ton of them made all at once, and now that toxin that's usually very scarce becomes very abundant. Some of these toxins can be very dangerous. They can be like neurotoxins, such as the case with Karenia brevis, which is a really common species that is responsible for red tides. It can cause massive fish die-offs and also poison like other animals and people because it produces a toxin called brevetoxin that is a neurotoxin, and it can poison you. It can become it can enter into your food through like the fish that it encounters. So if you caught a fish that was in a red tide, that fish could be poisoned with the neurotoxin, and so you can get poisoned by eating it. But also, through wave action, that toxin can actually become airborne, and people report as they walk around places where red tides are active, that their eyes begin to sting because this stuff is making its way into their body and causing problems. Okay, so this is not the only cause of red tides, and dinoflagellates aren't even the only cause of red tides. Algal blooms can occur, with a variety of different kinds of algae. Okay, and that is really what we're talking about here. Now, when we talk about these plants and other kinds of algae, and we talk about their contributions for photosynthesis, super important, major source of oxygen on this planet. Okay, but we often think of this being something that like trees mainly do, that big redwoods out in like Oregon are contributing the vast majority of oxygen and doing the vast majority of photosynthesis on this planet. That's not actually true. Actually, a lot of this, a majority of this oxygen, is produced by microorganisms that are living in marine environments. So these species of ocean-dwelling plants, and also these different kinds of plant algae, diatoms, dinoflagellates, and also we didn't really talk about it, but cyanobacteria, a type of bacteria that can do photosynthesis. They are the major producers of oxygen on this planet, which is really impressive. Then we have this other kingdom called protozoa. Okay, now protozoans, really interesting, really complex organisms. These cells, they lack eyes, ears, noses, and so on, but they all have the ability to respond to stimuli. Now, as we previously covered, all of life can do this in some form or another. They can all sense their environment, at least aspects of it, and then change their behavior in response. But protozoans are very motile, and this movement makes responses really easy to observe, like this stentor species that we have here, that is sensing the environment and retracting into its little protective area here in response to something that it's sensing. Now, most of these groups are capable of movement, the vast majority of them, and they use this movement to do a bunch of things, like navigating this complex environment that they're in, seeking out food, prey, resources, or their preferred habitat where they like to live, avoiding predators, avoiding environmental threats, like, for example, a chemical that is becoming more concentrated. They can move in directions that are less concentrated. And even seeking out mates, because some of these species are sexual. Some. Now, these are single-celled organisms that are definitely larger than bacteria, most of them are. And it makes them much more easy to observe in the microscope. We don't have to magnify quite as much. So these were probably one of the first organisms that Leeuwenhoek began to see when he was talking about his animalcules. We can split up protozoans into three major groups. There are more, but these are the ones that we really talk about. This is mainly based on their movement behavior. Okay, so we have ciliates. Okay, ciliates move by beating cilia that are kind of all over their body, and it allows them to move in very complex ways. And essentially in 3D. Then you have the flagellates, that these organisms move with one or more flagella. Okay, and so they actually have a flagellum that sits out in front of them and whips around and pulls them in a specific direction. That's opposed to the way that we usually think about flagella, like, for example, with like sperm cells. It's usually the one that people think about when they think about things with flagella. Sperm cell will whip a flagellum behind it to push the cell forward. Flagellates will whip flagella in front of them to pull them forward. It's sort of the difference between like a propeller on a plane and a propeller on a boat, right? Then you have the amoeboids. And these are protozoans that use pseudopodia to move, basically a false foot. They're capable of deforming their cell membrane and stretching their bodies in really remarkable ways here, and kind of like moving in various directions at once. Okay, and that's where we find our amoebas and other groups like that. Now, there's another group that we have here called the sporozoans that it's not listed here. They don't really have a defined like movement organ, like for example, cilia, flagella, things like that. They do have movement, but they don't really showcase it quite as strikingly as this group. They're also exclusively parasites, whereas these groups are not all parasites. Some may be, but not all of them. And we will talk about some sporozoans coming up here in a second. But first, let's talk about protozoan parasites in general. Okay, so protozoans, a lot of them are actually very problematic. Not all of them, again. A lot of them are free living and are engaged in a lot of the same really interesting and helpful behaviors that a lot of bacteria, the free living bacteria, are involved in. But that doesn't excuse the ones that are actually parasitic. So a lot of protozoans can be problematic parasites and pathogens here. So there are some notable examples that I'm going to cover. There's obviously a lot more than this, but we have giardiasis, which is one that we see periodically. It's caused by Giardia species, and these are capable of causing the giardiasis is very extreme stomach cramps, diarrhea, other symptoms. And then we have amoebic dysentery, which is caused by entamoeba, different entamoeba species. Entamoeba histolytica is one of them that causes this. And this is, the cause of like significant dysentery symptoms, right? So it's kind of similar in a lot of ways to giardiasis, but perhaps a bit more extreme. And then you have toxoplasmosis, okay, which is caused by an infection with Toxoplasma gondii. This is another protozoan that's found in cat feces, typically also in undercooked meat. You can encounter it there. More impactful for other animals, it can cause like major health impacts for a variety of other mammals. For humans, it is less defined, although we have recently observed that toxoplasmosis is also associated with the rise of schizophrenia symptoms, and so that is one overlapping relationship there, which is being observed. Okay. Now, some of these diseases can be contracted by exposure to this stuff, as for example, giardiasis and amoebic dysentery. A lot of the time, it comes from water sources, drinking water fresh from a glacial stream or something like that. Well, that beautiful glacial stream still has a lot of life in it, and some of that life can cause disease. And then toxoplasmosis is one of these things that's closely associated with a system of parasitism, where the species Toxoplasma lives inside of cats, like feral cats, and then inside of mice, and then inside of cats again, and it's moving back and forth between them. It moves from mice to cats when cats eat mice, and then the cats pee and poop, and mice come across that and contract the disease that way, and the cycle repeats. But that cycle can be broken if, for example, a human gets in the way and then contracts like feral cat feces and things like that. Now, I am going to talk about one sporozoan parasite, and that is Plasmodium species. Okay, Plasmodium species. This is the agent of malaria. So there are several species that cause this infection. The main one is called Plasmodium falciparum. It evolved in mainly in Africa, originating in Africa, likely coinciding with like the origin of humans. As humans evolved, this disease also evolved and followed us. It was later, taken with us as humans, moved out of Africa and began to colonize other parts around the world, and so the disease followed us. Now, malaria itself is a cause of death that is one of the leading causes, actually, of death. So, in the 20th century, 150 to 300 million deaths from malaria alone over those 100 years. 2 to 5% of all deaths recorded in the 20th century were due to malaria. So this is a major cause of mortality for people. How does this work? Well, like many parasites, malaria goes through this very complex life cycle. Okay, now humans will come into contact with this disease. They'll contract it in a juvenile stage. This is where mosquitoes bite you, and the mosquito, if it's carrying malaria, well, as it drinks blood from you, it spits up a little bit into your wound that it created. And when it does, that creates the opportunity for malaria to jump from that carrier, that vector, to you, its new host. From there, it enters into the bloodstream. Then it travels to the liver for it to develop further. After it reaches a certain point in development, it will escape the liver and go back into the bloodstream where it will infect red blood cells. It'll actually invade the red blood cell and live inside of it, and continue to replicate. And this is actually where like the anemia that comes from malaria happens. Malaria is super weird because it kind of like comes in waves because the emergence, the development of these plasmodium parasites happens on sort of a pattern. They all emerge from their red blood cell hosts together and create a bunch of lysis, a bunch of breaking of these red blood cells. And so you can exhibit sudden waves of symptoms that then alleviate over some hours to days. And so then you're out and about, and mosquito comes and bites you and drinks your blood. Well, drinking that blood means that it's taken up some of these plasmodium cells. Okay, essentially perpetuating that cycle, allowing that mosquito to then escape, to take the pathogen with it and bite some new person. So, malaria is a disease that is vector borne. Okay, the mosquito in this case, the carrier of that disease, of that parasite, is a vector, an organism that transmits a disease. So this mainly when we talk about vectors, we talk about them as insects, also like arachnids like ticks and mites, and a variety of other animals as well. Not exclusively mosquitoes, but we often associate them most strongly because they are very problematic and they carry a lot of disease. Now, it isn't always the case that these mosquitoes are carrying disease, but they can, and when they do, they can physically transport that disease from one infected person to another. In this case, by drawing and drinking infected blood from one person and then going to bite another person. And even like malaria can survive inside of a mosquito for some time, even after its blood meal has been drank and consumed, right? So malaria is maybe the most well-known vector-borne disease, but there are many. There are many that we can talk about. and that you can explore. Okay, vectors ultimately, they're not just disease taxis, right? They don't just like take disease where it needs to go. They're also, for a lot of these vector-borne diseases, they are escape mechanisms. They are a way for this disease to escape the host that it infected and go to a new host. Okay, this is a really important aspect, an important part of the malaria life cycle, even this process. And so this is just one method of disease transmission that pathogens use. Later on in the semester, we're going to talk about a lot of these different methods in more detail and certainly expand more on vectors as well. So now it's worth noting that we just spent a lot of time talking about parasitic protozoans, but importantly, that's only a small subset of the diversity of protozoans. Many, I would argue most, are free-living species, meaning that they are grazers, predators, decomposers, photosynthesizers. They serve important roles in the food chains, they eat and they are eaten, and they help move nutrients in that way, moving it from one thing into another. For example, this Vorticella species on the left-hand side is feeding on bacteria. It is filtering bacteria out of the water column and eating it, taking the nutrients that are in those bacterial cells and putting it into its body. And then it in turn can be eaten by something else. Some other organism comes and eats that thing. Does not normally eat bacteria, but it will eat Vorticella. And so it allows the nutrients that were in the bacterial cells to move into these larger organisms by first being put inside that Vorticella. Okay? So these organisms, still very poorly understood, but they're really fascinating and really interesting. We're going to get a chance to look at some of these in class as well, which is pretty neat. So that's all for today. Next time we're going to talk about fungi and animals. That's the remaining eukaryotes on our list.